Hello, and welcome to this session of Meta's Deep Dives. I'm Ashley Oak Scott with Proven Media, a leading public relations and branding firm for the cannabis industry. Today, we'll be discussing the process for zoning and commercial real estate in the cannabis market, how you can mitigate risk with your project, best practices, and who should be a part of your team during this process. I'll be leading today's discussion with Brian Mclaren, Barrett Blackwell, and Patrick Maroney with Zone Properties, as well as Matthew Player with Zonomics. We're going to start with introductions. So Brian, if you want to tell us about yourself and Zone Properties.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ashley. We're very excited to be here, everyone that's tuning in. Hopefully we can provide some good information and some real tangible tools and processes for you all to succeed in your quest to become cannabis applicant winners. My name is Brian Mclaren. I'm the CEO of Zoned Properties, based here in Scottsdale, Arizona. We'll give you a little bit more information about what Zoned Properties does and who our company is in a moment here. Oh, I think Barrett, do you want to do an introduction for yourself there?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, everyone. Barrett Blackwell, COO with Zone Properties. Really excited to be here and participate in this. And prior to joining Zoned, I spent the better part of my career developing restaurant brands across the country: Cold Stone Creamery, Krispy Kreme Donuts, and am using that knowledge to develop dispensaries and other cannabis businesses, as well as legalization begins to roll out.
I'm Patrick Maroney, joined Zone Properties about a month ago as the Director of Real Estate. I'm a commercial real estate broker by trade. A couple years ago, started to specialize primarily, eventually exclusively, in the cannabis space, buying, selling, leasing, cultivations, dispensaries, helping clients really on both sides of the real estate transaction. And so am lucky enough, and in some cases unlucky enough, to have gone through quite a few of those deals, and excited to be here to try to help everyone out and talk about some of the ins and outs of it.
Hi everyone, Matthew Player here, CEO and founder of Zonomics. My background is in obviously data and technology, but originally urban planning, GIS, and data and technology. And now with the growth in the industry, we're really looking at and working closely with Zoned Properties in how we can apply our technology and data to the cannabis related space, particularly with such a growing interest in the space.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. First, we want to start out with the very beginning of this process, getting involved with the zoning, the commercial real estate for new license holders. I don't think some people realize that this is even a part of the process to getting a license. So, Barrett, I think you would have some good insight to how does the real estate zoning and permitting impact that application process for potential licensees?
Yeah, at the beginning, it's really about knowledge acquisition. So making sure that that applicants are going about the process in a slow and methodical way. Although the social equity applicants won't have to have real estate identified and secured to apply for their license, it's always good to make progress in understanding the process. So the one major thing is, although the state puts out the regulations for the recreational marijuana program, the localities, the cities and the counties in which those businesses are going to operate, they dictate where and how those businesses can go about their business. So they put out zoning codes, ordinances, which dictate the location. In some cases, they'll include setbacks where they're a certain number of feet away from what they call protected uses or sensitive uses. That could be things like a school, a church, those kind of identifiers. So again, although applicants won't need to have their real estate secured, it is always good to begin to learn about that in the beginning, which is something that hopefully we can help out with today. The other thing to keep in mind too is just who's going to be on your team as you work through those processes. So when it comes to identifying real estate, negotiating a lease, even building out your dispensary or your cultivation facility, start to put some thought into who are those players going to be, who are those partners going to be in that process. A big thing too that we preach to our clients at Zoned and people in the industry is just risk mitigation, making sure that people don't get caught in a situation where they're going to have significant liabilities if and when their application falls through, or if for whatever reason regulations do change. So just high level overview on things to look out for.
Yeah, and I think for everyone kind of listening, tuning in, watching, to set the stage a little bit here along that overview, Barrick, for the importance of this session for social equity applicants and really for anyone getting involved in the regulated cannabis industry. From our perspective at Zoned Properties, that's what we do from a real estate development firm perspective. So to give everyone context from both Zoned Properties, and then I'll pass it over to you, Matt, in a moment for Zonomics background. What our firm does is touch every single piece of the puzzle that relates to real estate. And especially as you're preparing for and approaching your application, you're going to have a lot of balls up in the air that you're juggling. You're going to have to worry about putting your operational pieces together. You're going to have to worry about arranging capital financing. You're going to have to start and then continue studying and perfecting the knowledge of what the Arizona social equity application process and regulations look like. If you are using this and tuning in from another state in your own state program. And we've found that the real estate can be one of those pieces of the puzzle that either tends to get overlooked or tends to be an area where there is so much wide range and then specific depth of information and detail and complexity that it's so important to have expertise, either if you have that expertise already or to recruit that expertise and knowledge base. And for Zoned Properties, we like to think about the process really from start to finish for how to develop and deliver a successful real estate project. So everything from the beginning of site identification, navigating the compliance, the permitting, the zoning, how to design a facility, how you're going to develop and construct that facility. And then after the facility is done and delivered to you as the operator, how do you maintain and stay in compliance and operations as you proceed forward? And so lots of pieces to that process. And in the very beginning, site identification and zoning is critical. And that's really, Matt, your whole background.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so Zonomics, just briefly, is a multi-format data platform that basically removes the hurdles to accessing good zoning information through a map-based solution, or whether that be APIs or other data, more integrated data solutions. And I wanted to step back a little bit when we're talking about zoning. We're really talking about zoning regulations are really the rules that determine what kind of buildings can be built where and how they vary across a city. And every city has a very different code and system. And these codes are the reason why, for example, there's not a fast food restaurant at the end of your cul-de-sac, or in this case, why there is not a cannabis dispensary next to your church. So this is really what zoning is about, and permitting and zoning we can get into a little bit later, but it sort of is prescriptive and exclusionary in what activities and land uses you can take place, and whether that be in often cases for dispensary related uses, often a conditional use permit or a special use permit is how it's identified on a property, and then determines where you then need to lodge a permit to actually go through that process, and we can get into that in more detail. But that's a little bit of our background. What Zonomics does is make it easier to access that data, because traditionally you're having to look at a PDF map, and in most cities, and then a 500 to 1,000 page code document, which people are having to review to identify this information, or relying on professionals. So we're really about democratizing that process of accessing that data, so that it's easier for anybody to get up and running, to be just as informed as the most capitalized real estate companies in the world. They can access this data just like anyone else, and not have to sift through and surf through hours and hours of documentation for that.
Yeah, and that's, I think, Ashley, before you take us through a bunch of the questions and content we want to go through, Matt, to your point of democratizing this process, just one of the reasons we're certainly here today and trying to provide this information, and will be available for anyone listening that has follow-up questions, can certainly reach out to us. We'll share our contact information. But one of the things I love about the regulated cannabis industry, personally, I come from the sustainable development and urban planning world, and that process is very grassroots. It happens at the community level, and similar, as we all know, or if you don't know, really the same process for getting cannabis to become legalized and regulated. This has been a multi-decade, 50+ year process to get us to this point. And we're trying to hopefully provide the tools and resources for as many people as possible that are either transitioning from legacy markets, that are joining us on the regulated side, or maybe brand new to cannabis in general, and bring their expertise and talents into the space. So wonderful. All right, Ashley, where do you want to go from here?
I think I want to take a step back again and even just talk about, there's mainstream commercial real estate, and some people might think, oh, I can just, go to my real estate broker. But how important is it really to work with somebody that's worked in the cannabis space? Because there are some differences that I think people don't yet know if they haven't been in the industry yet.
Yeah. And Pat, I think I might kick this to you. I mean, one of the reasons you and I have known each other now for years, and one of the reasons we were so excited to bring you onto Zoned as our director of real estate, is this exact point. It's, I guess it's getting better, right? More and more traditional brokers are considering entering the cannabis space. But what's been your experience over the years working these deals from a traditional versus cannabis perspective?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually, a few years ago, when I decided I kind of wanted to try my hand at doing some cannabis transactions, I saw a bit of an opportunity there. And I kind of told myself I would continue to do traditional commercial real estate, and then I'll do cannabis, maybe 50% or on the side, or also kind of have that in my tool set. I quickly learned that you really have to jump in with 2 feet. There's just too many components of the business that are required to not only get deals done, but really be able to serve your clients in a professional and thorough way. I mean, the financing, the licensing, the zoning and permitting, obviously. It is commercial real estate, but it is within a whole different set of challenges beyond that. And those have to be worked into your real estate transaction. I mean, obviously, you have to have the licensing component figured out. You need to be well capitalized, whether that's through a variety of different sources. But as of right now, it can't be through, any FDIC insured bank. And so that takes a level of understanding. And then, on the real estate side, it obviously starts with the land use and the zoning and permitting challenges and site identification stuff that sort of comes with that. And that's really the first hard step is understanding with the city or the county, what the zoning code is, what zones you're allowed in, getting a full picture of the sensitive or protected uses in the area, and do you meet those setbacks? And then from there, if you think you have a qualified property, it's really, it becomes about the negotiation at that point. And unlike a normal commercial real estate transaction where you sign a lease and you move in, or you do a typical 30-day diligence and 30-day close, that's just not going to work on a cannabis property. You need more time. You need the ability to negotiate with landlords and sellers, be able to not only present yourself as a real business and a real opportunity, but be able to do what you say you're going to do. I mean, it just takes it's definitely more difficult and more strenuous, and there's more hoops to jump through on the cannabis side of things. And so obviously, the Zone team here, we're trying to make this easier on our clients, and as time goes on, that also helps as the general public becomes more informed on it. And obviously the Zonomics platform is going to streamline our process by a lot, but it's not easy. And I would advise anyone that comes from the commercial real estate world that says they can do this, no questions asked, and run it like a normal deal. I think you're asking for trouble there. So yeah.
And then on the landlord side, what would you say are those top things that a license holder is going to need to prove to the landlord that they should have this space?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing on a lease deal is to make sure and independently verify that your landlord either owns the property outright, all cash, or their lender is not going to be an obstruction to a lease. I have had deals die close to the finish line because in the lease language, they were not allowed to lease to a cannabis group. Their lender would have come calling, and that presents obviously a major issue for my client, and the deal died right there. So that's the first step. And then, every landlord's a little bit different. And it's your job when you're representing them or when you're talking to these people to sort of understand where they're coming from. But, unless you're an established cash flowing business and you have the financials to justify a corporate guarantee, you need to show some financial liquidity. You need to prepare perhaps for a larger security deposit. You need to prepare for a personal guarantee, and there's going to be some trades made to try to convince them to lease with you. And there's many different forms that trade can take. Sometimes it's a lease premium. Sometimes, like I said, it's a larger security deposit. I mean, I think the best thing that a cannabis company or a cannabis operator can do to convince a client is just be organized, be transparent, and really be ahead of the game at understanding the steps from the land use side, the step from the building side. For example, on cultivations, if the landlord's going to find out how much money is going into their property, and they're going to want to know that you have the team in place to be able to build out that space and get it cash flowing. They don't want, even though it's not the end of the world for these landlords, they don't want to see a tenant default. That's still not good for them. And so, my preference is to be as transparent as possible about the group, the industry. I mean, when I'm representing clients on the tenant side, I encourage them to send bios, investment snapshots, obviously financials when the time is right. And just show, share land use, legal due diligence, anything that shows, we're prepared to take this on and we know what we're doing.
Yeah. And I think that's phenomenal advice and guidance for anyone entering the cannabis space, specifically for, I think, a lot of the audience members initially for this session that are looking at the social equity process here in Arizona. We understand currently, while some of this regulation and process is still evolving, the current understanding is that application process is going to open in December at the end of 2021, and will produce 26 winners of a lottery as part of that application process. I think it might be helpful for audience members to understand a bit further, Barrick, if you would give an overview here. How does the social equity application process differ from some of the other application processes in Arizona and other states, as far as what you need on the real estate side, what you have to have ready, and then if you win that lottery, if you're one of the lucky 26, how does that maybe impact the circumstances of those 26 winners?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, how does it differ? Just recently in Arizona, we went through a rural county license round, which means any county that had less than 2 dispensaries, they were going to issue a new license to backfill up to 2 operating licenses within the county. And that was to offer product to or access to product for Arizona residents. During that process, in order to apply, they had to get 2 forms signed, 2 single-page forms. One was a landlord authorization letter, basically saying that that property owner was willing to sell or lease you their property for cannabis use. The second one was a zoning authorization letter from the local jurisdiction. That could have been a county or a city. So you had to have both of those forms filled out and signed to apply for your license. What's different about the social equity round is there is no requirement to have those forms filled out. So you're able to apply without those forms. You don't need to have that diligence done ahead of time. But with that said, as soon as you win that license, there's going to be 26 groups looking for the same pool of real estate within the Phoenix metro area, highly populated areas. The difference, again, between the rural and the social equity, the rural licenses, the dispensary or retail piece could only stay within the county that it was issued. Social equity, you're able to put it anywhere in the state of Arizona that will allow it, the cities will allow it. So you're going to have 26 groups who are all vying for the same piece of property in order to access.
Oh, Eric's connection here. I'll jump in.
Access what?
The $1 million question. Where do they got to access, Eric? So where Barrick was going with this, even though you are not required to have your property and zoning authorization forms for a successful application submittal, if you are one of the 26 lucky winners, those same exact forms are what the state department is going to require you to have to actually submit for what's called an authority to operate. That's kind of your final document you need in place to get inspected by the state in order to open your facility. And for clarity's sake for everyone, in Arizona, these are vertical licenses. So these 26 winners are going to have access to both the initial retail piece, which needs to be opened in order to unlock cultivation and manufacturing that can either be a part adjacent to that retail dispensary site or can be off-site its own facility. And so these forms Barrick was just discussing, those will be required in order to successfully develop and operate each of those pieces of property. And navigating that process once you win, and Barrick, I'll toss this back over to you here now that you're back with us. How much, to that regard, Barrick, how much do social equity applicants in this case want to prepare, even if they don't need it for the application submittal, how much do they want to have ready to go in case they win? And maybe also, what are some of the risks if they do too much and they lose?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point, and I must have spotty internet, so apologize for that. But yeah, so I kind of going back to my first answer, really just getting familiar with the process. So understanding what does it take to find a site that is zoned properly, that meets all of the setback restrictions, that basically has a checked box from the locality that this property will work for cannabis. How does that process work? How difficult is it, depending on where that applicant wants to be? That would be a good place to start. Really understanding, again, the processes and all that. To your second point, if you go too far and you try to be a little bit too ambitious by securing a property ahead of winning a license, you really need to make sure that you have a risk mitigation strategy put in place. So that could be an opt-out or a back-out if you do not win the license. It could be in the form of an LOI that's non-binding, but gives you access in the event that you win. It could be a lockup period where you submit some sort of a deposit that takes that property off market for a certain period of time. These are all things that we deal with at Zoned on a day-to-day basis that offer our clients ways to make sure that they're not stuck in some sort of long-term liability. And we've heard stories on the Zone side, horrific stories of people that end up paying tens of thousands of dollars in rent a month while they wait to see if their application is going to be approved. And this is, this is a crazy, it's a crazy story, right? You don't want that to happen. So having experts on your team, people within your brain trust or your circle to advise on that process is always a good idea.
Yeah, and I mean, part of this session is really trying to give the audience kind of a window into our project management discussions, right, guys? I mean, we're constantly, every project is different. The variables are changed. How do you mitigate risk? Having a really good real estate or land use attorney as a resource is very important. At Zoned Properties, we are all real estate development experts. We are not attorneys. Important distinction. So really knowing where the appropriate licensed expertise is coming from is so vital. I mean, quickly, Ashley, before, I don't mean to take your thunder here as a moderator, but important on this point, maybe Pat, if you could shed some light to this. I mean, as you're approaching, let's call it real estate prospecting, before you know whether you've won or not, how do you approach a property owner, a landlord, a seller? I mean, really, what does that process look like if you want to take that first step before finding out if you've won the lottery?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to just being transparent with them about your purposes, kind of bringing them in the loop on what you're doing and what you're looking for. I would say having as much of that background work done on the property before going to the property owner is a big positive. Educating them on the industry, but not over educating them on the industry. And that may sound a little misleading, but making sure they're aware of the opportunity here, but also kind of guarding yourself against somehow being taken advantage of. And honestly, if they try to lock you into something that presents too much liability for you going forward, you got to be prepared to move on. I know when we were working on the rural licenses, we had a whole stable of potential properties that worked. And so if it didn't work for our clients, we moved on pretty quickly. And so approaching them with an idea of what they're doing, and then even if you have a certain deal structure in mind, presenting, some sort of flexibility and being open on how you want to participate together could be an avenue worth exploring if you find the right property owner.
I do want to get into location because that is kind of a big deal in commercial real estate. And as Barrick was saying, a lot of these equity license winners, they're probably all going to be going after the same types of locations because if they want to be in, say, Phoenix, there's limited places that they can try to contract with. So on that note, what do we think are the top things that we want to look for in a property outside of being allowed? And if everybody's looking at the same things, like what are some things that can take you away from some of that competition?
Yeah, and maybe I'll kick us off on that one, Ashley, and Matt, I'm about to toss it to you on the Zonomics side, but there's a lot of those variables for your own project that have nothing to do with cannabis. Certainly you need to navigate restrictions and regulations that might be in place in the municipality or county you're looking. So for example, some cities like Phoenix restrict a maximum size of square footage that your retail dispensary can be. But also just, Matt, I know when we started talking a couple of years ago about how can Zone Properties and Zonomics come together to help, almost I think about it like the game board, right? Like a part of GIS and geo mapping and what Zonomics does is just, what does the landscape look like? Can you share some light on that, even non-cannabis, about how you approach building height or setbacks or traffic patterns on the development side?
Yeah, absolutely. So, previously, and to a large extent, this sort of exercise was really having to be done in-house with large teams. In the first part, the information wasn't there and the data wasn't there. And therefore, you couldn't put it into tools and software to apply to it, because one of the ways to answer Ashley's questions that you could speed up or open up the ability to find sites quicker or look at potentially more complex sites, or sites that are maybe a lot not coming straight to you, is to be able to really analyze the map and really analyze the code and see what's available. What we're trying to do is have that data in a digital format, so then you can apply all the other traditional real estate tools to it, so that you could, from a point of view, search a market, then filter via zones that permit certain things, or filter via the land use, whether that land use would permit a cannabis dispensary or medical dispensary, and where in the actual, from a starting point, where in the actual municipality or township does it permit that type of use. And there you've already narrowed down where you're looking from that point of view. And then cannabis has some other things a part of that, and you can then start to look at, building envelope. Well, what is the building controls around that? And that comes back to the code as well. And once that data is available, then you can punch it into a tool and make that a software-based tool to be able to do that quicker. And then finally, cannabis has some unique controls that are specific to that use, whether that be, as I think Barack or Patrick already mentioned, setbacks. They'll set setbacks that you need to be from a protected use. And then so utilizing tools to be able to identify very quickly whether a property, although it's permitted via the land use and zoning restrictions, is it now crossed out because it's too close to a church, or it's too close to a school, or if it's in a green zone very quickly, okay, that site is now on my prospect list of a potential property. And it may be a site that most people are not aware of, because you've been able to do this exercise and broaden it rather than waiting on, if we're looking at from a listing point of view, in a large part, that's going to be a site with a lot of competition to access that site. So doing it from this way, where you're having the data, doing an analysis with utilizing the power of technology and big data, we can broaden the opportunity for the site. And the key here is also, this is what the cities are doing with the zoning. And this is what we sort of saw, it was kind of backwards when we first came to the approach, is cities are zoning a certain way because they want to invest in it, but then it gets buried in a PDF document, or it gets buried in the city maps, and it becomes more difficult for the average real estate investor to go and then make those decisions.
Yeah, and kind of taking that one step further, if you find a property that you think qualifies or is permittable, or you see a pathway to approval, whatever it might be, depending on the city or the county, there are definitely site-specific things that need to be assessed. Like on a dispensary, it really becomes a typical retail question. How visible is the site? What's the traffic? Where are the other close dispensaries? Even if they're outside the setback, maybe there's a cluster of dispensaries, and you want to go to an area where it's a little bit less competition in that area. Parking in dispensaries has been a huge issue on deals that I've worked on. And then cultivation, specifically indoor, it becomes critical to quickly assess the power situation. These are heavy power facilities. How can you upgrade it? What is the timing and cost of that? Clear height matters to some growers, depending on the cultivation style. Cooling matters. And then just kind of determining a general TI budget, development budget, however you want to categorize it. It kind of shifts back to a normal real estate deal with abnormal financing and build out needs, I should say. So, and then on the outdoor side, it's more of a, where is it in the development? What's the water situation, environmental, and all that. And so, once the Zonomics team and us are able to kind of do our job on the site identification side, it kind of circles back to, all right, what are the next steps here? And is this a good, property to work on for all those variables?
Yeah. And Pat, I think in that commentary, something so important there is asking a wide variety of the right questions. So one of the reasons in our discussion here today, I think we're not necessarily giving all these pointed, very specific answers, is that every single project intention will be a little different. It's one of the real parts of the complexity on the real estate development for regulated cannabis, is that it's different everywhere. It's different for every team. And it's all about what are the right questions to ask, and really asking yourselves as your own project team. So whether you're handling some of this work in-house as a team on your own, or whether you're looking to recruit in an expert, an advisor, an attorney, a real estate broker to assist you, there are so many unknowns in regulated cannabis as this market evolves. There's so much need to have that ability to pivot, to adapt, and overcome some of the challenges. So the more items you can define and know for yourself and have clarity on, the better you'll be able to handle the things you can't. So, where do I want to operate my business? If you just because you find a site somewhere, if you're going to grow that business, you better be excited to go there all the time to manage it. Where am I going to source employees to operate my business? Or in that same context, on the real estate development side, if it's a construction or tenant improvement project, a remodel, are there general contractors and subcontractors available in this area to help me build my project? And these are all the things typically when we tackle a new project, either internally at Zone Properties or for third-party clients, we always start by building that question base, building our action plan, our roadmap. And very pointedly, one of the only reasons we know how to do this work is because we went through it ourselves. We failed on every single part of that process when we acquired and invested in our own portfolio of properties, when we developed it. And at the end of the day, when you start to get overwhelmed, be patient with yourself, take a breath, step back and start asking questions. Huge in this process, for sure.
So we keep talking about the environment that you possibly could have your dispensary cultivation site in. Something that a lot of people don't realize is you need to be thinking about the community. And it's not just about where are the churches, it's about the people in the community and creating that relationship. So what are some things that you would say play into that real estate decision when it comes to a community? And how important is that in the process of creating your project?
Yeah, I'll jump in here, guys. So community for us at Zones is a strong pillar for us. Community and corporate responsibility in general, and just really from a good business practice outside of cannabis, even we've always preached that. So specifically with cannabis, getting involved in the community, being a steward of your immediate surroundings, the neighborhood, the local planning officials, really bringing that human element to the business is really a huge thing that we preach to all of our clients. So what does that mean? That means getting out in front of the city officials that you're going to be operating with, creating real relationships. And it's not just a flashy one and done situation where you're doing it to get your application or getting a form signed. Really believing in what you're doing, and that could be anything from a donation to putting something, an initiative longer term to fund something in the community, something like that, where it's a constant project and something that even your employees can feel good about. And the benefits of that are huge. Long-term regulations will change. There will be different people in the planning office. So just making sure that that's top of mind. And look, we're building a new industry, right? So cannabis changes every day. We're pioneers in this, and so we really want to make sure we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, and that's just, for me, it's one of the most exciting things about this industry. And when we tackle these projects, And especially in the context of social equity programs, it's all about the community. I mean, one of the really interesting pieces of the Arizona program and what qualifies someone to become a social equity applicant is all about attempting to rebalance and reverse the damage from the war on drugs and the war on cannabis. And so inherently, the operators under the social equity program, if it goes with the spirit of the program, which I think we all hope it will, is that this is all also about transitioning cannabis experts from the legacy markets into the regulated market. And that grassroots advocacy part of that history is the best setup for being involved in the community, because I'm going to guess most of you already are very involved in your community. It's not as much about a, necessarily a big corporation coming in or a big capital investor coming in without those boots on the ground. And that's where those partnerships make that possible. That's where all of you as social equity applicants and the 26 winners can really leverage your value to also find capital partners that tie into the local community. If you have experience operating within the legacy market, that's part of that grassroots movement that can be very, very powerful. And specifically for everyone, we typically like to look at 3 main target points for local community interaction. You want to go first to identify and make sure you know who your decision makers are. So the decision makers can be planning officials that are signing zoning authorization forms. It can be city councils, mayors. So who's actually going to dictate how you can operate your business? So that first one, decision makers. Second one is your neighbors. So who is in immediate adjacency or right next to your facility? If you end up leasing space in a multi-tenant retail strip, who's on both sides of you? There's going to be various noises, odors, foot traffic, and making sure that those around you, your neighbors, are educated. And you're going to face some adversity. There's going to be people that are not on board with regulated cannabis yet. So being patient with them, being kind, educating them is huge. So first, decision makers, second, your neighbors, and third, contractors. So contractors, again, being either employees of your business, so recruiting from the local community, and or contractors that are actually going to help you work on your business. So your vendors, where are you getting your equipment from? Where are you sourcing your security personnel from? Everything you're going to need to be successful. Those 3 touch points are so critical. And Barrick, you touched on this as well, and how you approach that. So important what we've found just in being a good steward of your community, but also good business intention. It's not just a one and done. So when we do public hearings in front of city councils and we're helping clients with getting zoning authorizations, or we're trying to amend zoning codes, or sometimes rezone properties or request a variance, one of the biggest mistakes we see groups and representative professionals of clients do is they go in swinging, they go in loud, they go in specifically with their goal in mind without thinking about the future. And you better expect that you're going to need to go back to that exact same body, that exact same hearing process for something down the road. And it's so much easier when they remember you as a respectful, kind professional that's trying to bring good to the community, good economic development, new jobs, new tax dollars, property values increasing. So important.
Right. So we talked a lot about before you find your location. When you find your location, is there a difference in the cannabis industry from buying a location versus leasing? And how do you think people should look at that? Like, what are the pros and cons of going in that direction?
Yeah, sure. I can start here, and then I'll probably pass it over to Pat. But yeah, so when it comes to, I think the obvious answer, obviously, for purchasing is you have a lot more control of what you can do with the property. When you're engaging in a lease, you have a set of obligations that are above and beyond just the rental payment. So you have certain standards that you need to keep the building. There might be certain programs that you have to submit to a landlord on an annual basis. Those could be odor mitigation, pest control items, things like that you'll have to submit. So it really just comes down to control. Pat, anything you want to add on that in terms of the differences?
Yeah, I think it really depends on whether to lease or purchase. I mean, to be honest, in some instance, you can't really be too choosy. It's going to come down to one or two properties. Maybe you negotiate them both simultaneously, and see what happens. I mean, obviously, if I'm representing a tenant, we always try to work in a fixed option to purchase. A lot of landlords balk at that, but that's just kind of part of the negotiation. I think, long term, for companies with larger goals, it can become a necessity to own your real estate or have the option to own your real estate at some point. Now, that's not a concern for everyone. I will back up a little bit to go to the real estate transaction side. If you identify a property that works and you still have to go through the process, fitting in your land use permitting timeframe into the transaction is essential. And obviously this is what we do here at Zoned on a daily basis, but making sure the landlord understands that we need X amount of time to pursue this. We can't close until we do. We can't have a signed lease until we do. And then you make trades based on that. I mean, it depends on market factors. Arizona 2021, it's been very difficult for tenants and buyers, cannabis tenants and buyers to negotiate enough time. A lot of them have to offer up non-refundable money or other concessions in order to basically to buy the time. And that's because the market has been so hot. But having something in mind there, and then maybe there's a credit if you get the permit on some of your upfront expenses that get tied back into the real estate, and try to work a favorable deal based on that. I think a big thing that I see with a lot of startups, because the money is so tight at the beginning, is trying to work in some rental abatement. I mean, you're going to have a lot of upfront expenses on the land use side, permitting, and then ultimately construction and build out, and finding a landlord that will let you play ball by giving you some runway to get things up and running can be incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, and that, Pat, I think that's huge too. Just finding that partner on the landlord side, if you're going to lease, that really understands the runway and the roadmap. So in real estate, we have a term called highest and best use when it comes to what a property's valuation is and how it operates. And what highest and best use means in real estate is what use of that piece of property, that building, that real estate is going to yield the most value. And in regulated cannabis, often a cannabis site, given the complexity, the low supply of available properties with the high demand. So again, we're going to see that when 26 winners all start to go to market if they haven't locked up property already. But oftentimes cannabis is that highest and best use. So having a landlord that understands your business, understands the value potential for them. And then also, again, if you go the other route of trying to acquire and own the property yourself, same communication for a potential investor. So Pat, you mentioned this earlier, very difficult with the federal status of legality for cannabis legalization and regulating, very difficult to get traditional loans and financing for a real estate project. So you want to make sure you can communicate to an investor that could be the one as your partner lending you money on this, where that valuation is for you to buy that property and have that value owned by your company and your investor, rather than necessarily paying that value to a third party like a landlord. Though the caveat to all that is it depends on location. So, if you can convince a landlord in a really exciting commercial strip center to house your dispensary retail location there, some of those sites are hundreds of millions of dollars in value. So,
and you do see situations where, the flip end of that, where people, companies want to lease, they prefer to lease. Especially, I see that a little bit more, I think, on the retail side, and they find financial, or I should say real estate partners that that have a whole portfolio of their properties. And so it really is just dependent on each company and what their goals are.
Right. And understanding what terms you're getting into. So again, make sure you have access to good legal resource, especially if you're entering into a lease agreement. It's not just as Barrick mentioned earlier, it's not just about making sure you pay every month. You need to really understand the terms of that contract. If it's a shorter lease, what a timeline for renegotiation might look like as variables in the market change. So before you sign on that dotted line, whether it's a letter of intent, opening escrow on a purchase and sale of a property, or entering into a lease agreement, really make sure you understand that document and how it could either help enhance the value of your cannabis business or potentially put the value of your cannabis business at risk.
So if you're leasing, going into the renewal phase, that's something that's important too, because there's been some problems with that within the cannabis industry as well. Even as much as like your neighbors in the building having a say in that. So what would you say can come out of those renegotiations, and what should you look for and be prepared for?
Yeah, really important for everyone kind of entering into the business. If you're entering into a real estate contract, this has happened across the country, really as this whole industry has been evolving as an emerging regulated market. Of course, the cannabis industry has been around for many, many years, and most social equity applicants, again, I'm going to imagine, have some very strong cannabis expertise. But when it comes to dealing with a third party on your real estate, again, either typically a landlord under a lease or an investor or debt holder on your property, getting to a point where you lose potential control of that contract. So Ashley, what you mentioned is, in this case, renewing a lease, really important. And our team at Zone Properties, we typically tend to deal with clients through our advisory services at one end of the spectrum or the other. So they're either coming to us early on, proactively trying to build their brain trust, bring in the expertise, or unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they're coming to us in triage mode. So something unexpected occurred, their permitting fell through, or in a lot of the cases, we get a lot of calls on, I'm in the middle of a landlord renegotiation on my lease. I've spent years establishing my business here. So retail dispensary, all your customers know where you are, you love where you are. And if you haven't looked to the future on that, a lot of times those landlords can realize, whether they're reading headlines, watching the value of cannabis companies, sometimes just outright greedy, and come to you and say, yeah, I'll let you stay here for another 2 years, but I want 5 times the rent you're paying now, or 10 times the rent you're paying now. Or understanding on the flip side, so always helpful to put yourself in the shoes or from the perspective of your partners or your landlord, what risks or experiences have they had if you're renegotiating the lease? This is a difficult business. There's going to be roadblocks and challenges, and construction will fail, and you may need to change contractors during your build out, things that can make a landlord very uneasy or worried about protecting their own property. So keeping that in mind and anticipating what's going to, on a lease agreement, when you're looking to renegotiate a renewal or an extension, if you're in that position, make sure you can provide value to that landlord, get them excited about wanting to keep you there rather than just seeing that check increase every month. And then hopefully the point of this whole session and everyone listening is you're being proactive about your project. You're approaching this social equity application process, or for anyone outside of Arizona that may be entering the market differently, thinking about these things up front. You want as long and as much control on a lease agreement as you can. The best cases, most win-win scenarios we find for both cannabis tenants and for cannabis landlords is long-term passive circumstances. So you're going to pay a premium almost always for that, and you need to communicate and understand the value your landlord's going to want from you. But the more control you have under a passive lease structure, and the longer you can retain, so negotiating in renewal options at your discretion, or the option to buy the building from your landlord at a certain period of time, or what we might call a first right, so giving you the contractual first position that if your landlord wants to sell his or her property, that you have the right to buy it at the same value as a third party might. Those are all really important. You're working your butt off to get your cannabis business operating and returning value for you. You don't want to be caught off guard on something like a lease renewal. And I'll say not just lease renewal, Ashley, too. Other things like local permitting, you may need to be required by the local municipality. Once you've received your approval that you're going to work really hard for, you might be required to submit a new security plan every year or a new odor mitigation plan every year. So really understanding the components and requirements of that permitting. And I'm realizing now we haven't talked too much about the use permitting specifically. Matt, can you kind of outlay beyond just the zoning that exists in a community, what typically happens when you need to go get a approval through use permitting?
Yeah, so and I think we even thought, just said that there's all sorts of other building permits and fire permits as well. And I'll just stick specifically to stuff that the planning department and the Board of Standards Appeals deals with. But in most cases, if you're permitted as a result of your zoning, what cities like to do is they'll set things out via whether it's permitted by as of right, and I can get that into more detail, or whether it's permitted by some sort of SUP or CUP, whether it's a special use permit or a conditional use permit. An as of right permit just means you lodge your permit as long as it meets the requirements set out in the zoning code and the building code. You should have a pretty smooth process to getting that permit through, because you've got an as of right to be able to construct or do that activity on that according to the zoning code. Special use permit or conditional use permit, and it does vary city to city what they'll call that, but that's generically what they come, even if they have come by a different name. Usually what it means is it's you can do that activity if you meet certain additional standards, or whether the city has city council or board gets special approval process that you may have to go up and get it approved. Now we find, and Brian has more detail on that, but we find often the cannabis related uses often fall under the CUP or SUP categories, just because there's more controls and around those. And so there's usually a longer process to get those permits than a traditional as of right permit. And then finally, in the unique situation where you may need an appeal or a variation, and Brian might have a bit more clear whether this ever happens at all, whether you actually even need a rezoning to take place. That's a separate process in itself, which is a land use rezoning permit, which takes a whole different process and would need to be established before you could even lodge your activity or building permit. That would need to take place prior to that. And if you also need a variance, that would need to take place. Well, you'd need to get it awarded, and it may be awarded concurrently, but you'd need to get that awarded before your building permit is, and then obviously occupancy permits and things like that. But I'm not sure, Brian, the result ever get for cannabis related uses.
Yeah, sometimes definitely on whether the current zoning of a piece of property might be zoned, a C1 or a light commercial designation, whereas the local municipality may only allow cannabis in a heavy commercial, a C2, C3, or industrial. So certainly one option a project team can take if they really like a property, they have all their pieces lined up, but it's in the wrong zoning. You can either try and get that property rezoned, or you can go for a variance request to allow it. But backing up just a little bit, because there were some really important pieces of information there, Matt, that you went over. And I want to talk specifically about Arizona for a moment, everyone. So as we're gearing up for social equity applications, awards, and then 26 new operators to enter the space, there's some verbiage and some defined terms and some just general industry terms we need to be aware of. So in the history of Arizona cannabis and medical marijuana licenses is really important. Very briefly, what has occurred is there originally prior to the rural licensing and now social equity licensing, 130 vertical licenses in the state. And those vertical licenses were medical only until the recent recreational adult use plan was approved and now is going into place. And that's the whole reason why we're here with social equity. But the designation is really important because what we know now is that all 130 of those medical operators were allowed through the regulations to apply to become dual operators or dual licenses, meaning that they are both medical and now also recreational. That term dual license or dual operator is very important when you start to look at county and municipal zoning language. So you have the 130 dual licenses, and then these new 2 license rounds, the rural licenses, of which there were 13 and now 26 social equity. You guys will not be dual licenses. You will have authority under the new adult use regulations to be adult use cannabis businesses. The reason this is very important when it comes to local zoning and use permitting is that it's all an education process. Remember, we spend a lot of time, all of us as members of the community, whether we're real estate professionals or local planners or cannabis operators. From the local planning perspective, what has happened is that a vast majority of counties and municipalities have adopted language only allowing dual licenses to receive permitting. This was in our belief, and again, we try to be ambassadors on behalf of this process, try to educate these local planners. We think it was probably something that was just an oversight, not understanding that 26 new social equity licenses were coming. So again, this is very important to understand because if you're going to look to a municipality that only allows dual licenses, it's very likely that that code needs to be amended or a variance accepted under your permitting to allow you as social equity operators that are not dual licensed. And we strongly believe that this will get worked out over the next 6 to 8 months, ideally. But as you're gearing up and researching, that's what those terms mean. And that will then affect everything, Matthew, you were just talking about on conditional use permitting or special use permitting. That local governing authority is going to give you requirements or what you might see as stipulations. So again, a security plan might need to be in place. You're probably going to have to submit proof of your license to the municipality or the county. And almost always you're going to have to go before either a public hearing or through an administrative review process. And I know lots of variables here, guys, lots of complexity, lots of information. And we are here to help however we can. And I know, Ashley, we're probably reaching near end of our session. So what else do we need to cover before we exit here?
That at time. So unless there was any other last tidbits you wanted to throw out there, but like you were saying, Zone Properties and Zonomics is available. So they'll give some information about themselves at the end. Unless you guys had something else that you wanted to contribute before we sign off.
Good on my end.
So Brian and Matt, why don't you let us know how people can reach out to the both of your companies if they want to get some more information? Go
ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sure. So pretty simple. Just visit us at zonomics.com. That's ZONEOMICS.com. Or simply drop us an email at info@zonomics.com, and also via social media channels as well.
Wonderful. And for us at Zone Properties, certainly before sharing contact info, just want to say thank you also, Ashley, Proven Media, for organizing and moderating us here. Definitely thank you to MITA, Marijuana Industry Trade Association, for producing, hosting this event. We really hope we're able to share some good information to the audience, anyone listening, and again, a resource. Truly, everyone that's watching or listening to this, feel free to reach out, ask questions. We're happy to share information, make referrals to other professionals that can join your brain trust. Thanks, Barrick and Pat, our real estate boots on the ground here. And feel free to visit us, zonedproperties.com. You can email us info@zonedproperties.com or clients@zonedproperties.com. or I believe our contact info will be available through the MITA website as well. And I'll leave a closing notion here for everyone. Just be kind to yourself, be kind to your team, be kind to your community. We find that the right balance of patience and persistence is what allows success in this industry. But it's going to be tough. There's going to be really frustrating times, and surrounding yourself by people that can help walk you off the ledge when you're feeling the rough spots, so important. And thank our team and our community here on the Zone side for being that resource for me. So.
Yes, such great advice and lots of great information here. So with that said, thank you everybody for tuning in today. And if you want to contact either of the companies, Zone Properties, Zonomics, please reach out to them. But thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.